Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY, and whether you're new or returning, it's great to have you here and I hope you enjoy the video. In this episode I'll be making a bowl from oak segmented rings, casting 3 colour epoxy resin. So without further ado, let's get into it. Fixed to the lathe are 2 oak segmented rings. These were glued up months ago and this seemed like a good project to use them. The black needed to be turned down to fit in the casting bucket, and the hole in the centre needed to be cleaned up, as this would be filled with resin and visible in the finished piece. With the centre done, I could fix it more securely to the chuck. Then the outside just needed to be cleaned up and trimmed down to a diameter of around 185mm. Then I faced off either end. Not strictly necessary, but I did it anyway. Then I finished off with a bit of sanding and it was done. Next was the casting. For this, I waxed the inside of the bucket to aid releasing the cured blank. The oak ring was centred using mixing sticks wedged down the side. Maybe next time I'll make it a tight fit. Then the waste block. This is some oddments of MDF superglued together and trimmed down on the lathe. The bits of mixing sticks superglued to the underside create a gap for the resin to run through into the hole underneath. I mixed 4 batches of epoxy. I wanted the bowl to be a bit higher than my other ones, and I figured I would lose 1 batch filling the hole in the oak blank. My chosen colours were black, gold and apple green mica powder. I did 2 black and 1 each of the other colours. Just show a couple being mixed. Because I'm using different colours, I let the resin pre-cure before adding them to the casting bucket. This was so I got better colour separation. Though I did pour one of the black batches in straight away, it seemed a waste to let the colours fill the void. Pre-curing the resin is a good way to stop the colours mixing together in the casting bucket, but care has to be taken. The batches will get hot, so I use a laser thermometer to check the temperatures. I won't show all the readings, but the ambient temperature was around 16 degrees C. About halfway through, the gold had heated up more than the rest, so I poured half of it into the bucket. The final temps were 70 to 80 degrees C. At this point, the gold resin had started to smoke, so I added them all to the casting. And with no time to waste, I added some weight to the top to hold everything in place. Then I put the whole thing in the pressure pot, screwed the lid down and added 50 to 55 psi. This was then left in a warm room to cure overnight. With the resin curing, I moved on to making the segmented rim. For this, I used a piece of oak, cut down to size on the bandsaw, then off camera, I passed it through the jointer thicknesser. That done, I then cut the segments using the miter saw. The rim has 18 segments, each one cut with the saw set to a 10-degree angle. and I have a stock block set to 42mm. To be safe, as each one is cut, I had to hold the blade down until the saw stopped, otherwise the cut piece could get caught in the spinning teeth. The glue up was next, but first a bit of sanding to remove the rough bits left by the saw. That done, I applied Type Bond 2 to 6 segments at a time, and once the ring was fully assembled, I used a hose clamp to add equal pressure to hold them nice and tight until the glue cured. Taps to seat each segment in place, and a final turn of the screw, it was placed to one side to allow the glue to cure. It's the next day, and with the blank removed from the pressure pot, first impressions look good. There were no visible cracks and just a small void on the side, which would be easily turned out. After chiseling off the excess waste block, I marked the centre and drilled 2 holes, one for the woodworm screw and a shallow one for the tailstock centre, but this is where I got my first indication of a problem. The hole in the base opened up a cavity, so I would have to deal with this later on. The next job was to cut a mortise in the base and face off the top. So after fixing the blank in the lathe using a woodworm screw and the tailstock to hold it securely in place, I set to with the Easy Wood Tools full-size finisher, removing material around the base, just enough to expose the oak and get it better balanced. Then I set to cutting the mortise. For this I defined the outer edge with a 1/4-inch parting tool, removing most of the inner material at the same time. Then I cut a dovetail with a dovetail cutter, and if you look closely, you can see a big crack within the recess. Mortise done, I turned the blank around to level the top, using the 3/8 bowl gouge to cut away the raised section of MDF, shear scraping it level with the resin. Then I switched to the full-size finisher to continue removing material, finishing with a skew chisel to remove the tool marks. The last bit in the middle was removed with a bowl gouge. The segmented rim was next. This had been glued up the day before, so it needed to be passed through the drum sander to level it up. I only really needed to do one side, but I did both whilst I was at it. Sanding done, I used the drill bit to measure off to position the rim. Then I scratched the line around the inner edge to help to align it. To fix the rim to the blank, I mixed a small amount of epoxy resin with black mica powder. This was spread around the edge and the rim was sat into it. Another quick measure to make sure it was positioned correctly, then I used hot melt glue to hold it in place until the resin cured. And after removing the drill bit, the excess was poured in to fill any gaps and also fill the hole in the centre. I was hoping this would be stronger after I re-drilled it for the woodworm screw. Another day has passed. I've re-drilled the hole for the woodworm screw and refixed the blank to the lathe. With the speed turned up to around 1000 RPM, I began turning. Using the EasyWood Tools full-size finisher, I set to getting the blank to round. This didn't take too long, and after a bit of shear scraping to clean up the rim, I started on the base section. Using the 1/2-inch bowl gouge, I began to form the cutout. I used the gouge to remove the bulk of the material, but to deepen it, I had to switch to the 1/2-inch spindle gouge. With its swept back grind, I use it to form a much sharper transition between the upper and the lower cut. At this point, I wasn't sure if I would cut all the way through to the resin in the core of the pedestal. I thought it might make it look a bit spindly. When I got to a reasonable depth, I used the bowl gouge to shear scrape the upper part, blending it into the side. Then I did some rough shaping on the rim. Then I went back to the cutout. It may seem like I'm jumping around from one bit to the next, but this is how I develop the design. Basically, I do a little bit to each part, refining the shape as I go. The base looked a bit thick, so using the bowl gouge, I thinned it down, switching to the spindle gouge to finish the cut, trying to be careful to avoid getting a catch, but I wasn't careful enough. Whilst turning the gouge over and offering it up to the next cut, the end of the blade dug into the surface and left a fairly deep gash. I didn't bother stopping the lathe, I just started another cut and kept going until the damage had gone. Thankfully, the damage was easily fixed, and I thought the base and cutout were more or less done, so I concentrated on the upper section, using the carbide cutter to refine the transition between the wooden base and the resin. Along with a bit of work from the bowl gouge, the round carbide cutting head was also great at shaping the joint between the rim and the lower part. Quick check, I decided to refine the shape of the cutout. So taking the spindle gouge, I began to remove more material. And wouldn't you believe it, I got another catch. This time the damage was pretty bad. This would take some time to fix. I also knew it would mean rethinking the design. There was nothing else for it except to cut through the damaged area. So I carefully used a spindle gouge to remove material, frequently stopping to check my progress. It took around 6 passes to fix it. The upper part of the cutout then needed to be blended back into the side. For this I used a skew chisel, refining the surface, blending and fairing it into one continuous curve. And after a bit more careful reshaping of the cutout, the diameter of the base needed to be reduced to be more in proportion to the upper section. This is where the design really began to change. Making the base smaller made it thicker, so I had to thin it down. Same as before, first using the bowl gouge to start the cut and shear scraping to form a more curvy shape, and finishing off the cut with a spindle gouge. This is where I cut through to the resin core, and once exposed, there was nothing for it except to make a feature of it. With the resin exposed, I switched to the mid-size carbide. This has a negative rate cutter, so there was less chance of getting a catch. And whilst cleaning away the oak from the resin, I noticed some cracking, so I filled it with Black Star Bond and used an activator to make it cure faster, and to give it time to fully cure, I turned my attention to the base and the mortise. First, the base needed to be levelled. For this, I used the bowl gouge to push cut through the excess resin and oak. Then I used a skew chisel to flatten it off. Then the mortise had to be cut deeper. This was done with a 1/4 inch parting tool. Then the dovetail was cut with a dovetail cutter. And finally, the rest was cut out with a bowl gouge. This opened up a large void, so I mixed some 5-minute epoxy coloured with black mica powder. This was used to repair the void, and after 5 to 10 minutes, with a bowl fixed to the lathe, I cleaned it up with a skew chisel, and then I sanded just the base to 800 grit and applied a wax finish. The Black Star Bond had cured, so using the carbide cutters, I gently removed the excess level with the resin. Then a bit more work refining the surface, and then I turned the bowl around. With the light shining in a different direction, I could see a few tool marks, so I used the skew to take care of that, and sanded with 80 grit, just to make sure I'd got them all. Outside done, I could start hollowing out. First, I roughly shaped the oak rim with a bowl gouge, then I switched to the carbide to cut through the top layer of resin to reveal the MDF waste block. The carbide just turns the MDF to dust, so I went back to the bowl gouge. Using this, I was able to cut it out in ribbons, keeping the fine particles down to a minimum. And just for note, I'm wearing a Trend Air Shield Pro, which is rated for use with MDF, and it's also worth pointing out that the MDF has soaked up quite a lot of resin, so that was just a solid mass, which was very easy to cut out. Using a freshly sharpened gouge, I was able to quickly remove most of the waste block, so I went back to the full-size carbide. This peeled away streams of resin-impregnated MDF, but until I got rid of most of the weight, I was getting a bit of vibration, which loosened the chuck, forcing me to stop more often to check it was still tight. Tailstock still in place, I concentrated on shaping the rim and thinning down the sidewall. I was aiming for a wall thickness on the thin side of 1/2 inch or 13mm. I wanted the resin in this bowl to be opaque, so the colours didn't look diluted. When I broke through to the oak in the base, I knew I'd gone deep enough, so I removed a bit more from the sidewall and got the rim roughly to shape, and having checked the chuck was still tight, I cut away the centre support. Having removed the support, I cleaned up the base using the bowl gouge, but this kept grabbing, threatening another catch, so I used a full-size carbide to cut away what was left, This revealed another crack in the resin, which would need some attention. I used a large negative rake scraper to level the base and blend and fare the side into the rim. Then I used black Star Bond with an activator to fill the void. Five-minute epoxy would have been better for filling a deep crack like this, but I'd run out, so black Star Bond was the next best thing. I made sure I got plenty in, then sprayed it with activator, then added more till it was full. A final spray of activator, then I left it for 20 minutes to fully harden. I found that sanding it first, then levelling it with a scraper works best when doing this kind of repair, otherwise the scraper just tears the glue out and you have to start again. The final go with a full-size carbide and it was done. Then I sanded inside and out from 80 to 600 grit, continuing up to 3000 grit just on the resin. Sanding done, I cleaned down with denatured alcohol, then I applied 2 coats of sanding sealer, each one de-nibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Next, Yorkshire grit. A single application, thoroughly cleaned away until no more residue is picking up on the paper towel. Then the resin polishing, beginning with Mirka Polar Shine 10. Just a single coat, thoroughly cleaned away with more paper towel. This is quickly followed by Polar Shine 5, another single application, thoroughly polished off to leave a deep shine. And to finish, Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax, 2 coats, buffed to seal and protect the surface. And that's it, another project finished, and I really like this one, and I hope you like it too. This might be my new favourite. The colour combination and separation in the resin looks stunning set against the lighter coloured oak. I will be doing another one quite soon, probably with walnut, as suggested by Ellen in the comments last week. With that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already, a thumbs up will be great, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.